I sat by myself at the kitchen table, stirring the same cold cup of tea I'd made hours earlier, letting the stillness of the apartment wrap around me like a heavy blanket. The dim kitchen lights cast soft shadows on the walls, while outside, the city lights flickered, almost as if they were mocking the silence that hung so heavily inside. I could still remember when this place felt full of life, filled with laughter and endless late-night conversations. But those days now seemed so distant, fading like an old photograph tucked away in some forgotten drawer. Then, out of nowhere, the front door clicked open, and a familiar voice called out into the quiet, breaking the stillness and pulling me from my thoughts. It was my husband's son. He had just returned after spending a long time overseas, and although we'd hardly seen each other over the years, I was shocked by how much he had changed. He stood in the doorway, looking different, older, with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. "Hey, hope I'm not interrupting," he said, his voice calm but edged with uncertainty as he stepped inside and looked around as if trying to recall the place. "No, not at all," I answered, gesturing to the seat across from me. "Actually, I could use the company." He pulled out a chair, and we sat across from each other, the hum of the city below filling the silence between us as we started talking. I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. It was easy, almost natural, like slipping into a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd missed. We talked about everything and nothing. The people he had met, the places he'd been, what it felt like to finally be home. I listened, genuinely interested, letting his stories fill the empty spaces in my mind that had grown restless and lonely over the years. Then, at one point, he paused. Our eyes met, and in that brief moment, the silence between us felt loaded, like the pause before the first note of a song. His gaze was steady, and for a heartbeat, I felt disoriented, as if I'd forgotten who I was, where I was, or even why he was there. The room seemed to shrink around us, and the silence grew thicker, hanging in the air like something unspoken. I'm not sure what came over me, but suddenly, without thinking, I leaned forward. It was the lightest touch, barely more than a whisper against his lips. And yet, it carried a weight that lingered in the air between us, binding us in an unspoken understanding. The moment passed as quickly as it had come, and when I pulled back, I was overwhelmed with a rush of conflicting emotions, guilt, surprise, and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. He blinked, staring at me as though seeing me for the first time, and I could see the storm of thoughts passing behind his eyes, but he didn't say anything. He stood up, hesitated, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked toward his room, leaving me alone again as the door closed softly behind him. The weight of what had just happened hit me all at once, and my heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. In the stillness of the night, I was left to grapple with the storm of emotions I had unwittingly set in motion. I couldn't help but wonder what this meant for us, and what kind of uncharted territory we'd just stepped into. The next morning he avoided me. Every time I tried to catch his eye, he'd turn away, his face unreadable. It was like the night before hadn't happened, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew he felt the impact of that fleeting touch as strongly as I did. I tried to distract myself, going through my usual routine, but my mind kept returning to that moment in the dimly lit kitchen. It wasn't something I could easily forget, and truth be told, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The day dragged on, and the emptiness of the apartment pressed in on me. My husband was away on another business trip, and the loneliness I had grown used to now felt different, sharper, somehow, filled with an intensity one couldn't ignore. I wondered if he felt it too. Just as that thought crossed my mind, I heard his footsteps approaching, slow and uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether to come closer. We met in the hallway. He hesitated, glancing at the floor, avoiding my gaze. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come. "I think we need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, though in the stillness it seemed to echo. He looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time since the night before. "Yeah," he said, his voice just as soft as mine. "I think we should." We ended up sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had started. The tension between us was palpable, like a rope stretched too tight, ready to snap at any moment. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. I could see he was struggling to find the right words, just as I was. My fingers fidgeted on the table, tracing the edge of my coffee cup nervously. Finally, he broke the silence. "I didn't expect any of this," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "Last night it took me by surprise." I nodded, my eyes falling to the cup in front of me. "It surprised me too," I admitted, feeling a strange sense of relief just saying it aloud. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't even know what it means." For a moment, it seemed like he wanted to say more, but he held back, his expression conflicted. I could see the battle within him, the tension between what he thought he should feel and what he actually felt. The same conflict churned inside me. I wanted to reach across the table to bridge the distance between us, but I knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't know what to think," he finally said, his voice barely audible, as though he was speaking to himself. "But I can't ignore it. I can't just pretend it didn't happen." His words hung in the air, charged with a weight neither of us could deny. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe we don't have to pretend," I replied, surprised by the boldness of my own words, the thoughts spilling out before I could stop them. He looked up then, his eyes locking with mine in a way that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. In that moment, the tension that had been building between us felt almost unbearable. Without thinking, I reached across the table, my hand finding his. It was just a touch, but it felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. We stayed like that for a long moment, the silence heavy with all the things neither of us could say. But just as suddenly as he had appeared in the hallway, he pulled his hand back, breaking the connection. I should go," he said, his voice tight and strained. He stood up, and I could see the conflict written all over his face. He was torn, just as I was, caught between what was right and what felt impossible to resist. Without another word, he turned and left the kitchen, his footsteps echoing down the hall as he disappeared into his room, leaving me alone again. But this time, the emptiness felt different. The quiet of the apartment seemed to press down on me, as if the very walls could sense the secret we had just shared. I sat there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't something either of us could just ignore. As the minutes passed, I realized with a creeping sense of dread that this was only the beginning. I had woken up that morning determined to shake off the weight of the previous day's emotions. I thought fresh air might help clear my mind. So I pulled out my running clothes, hoping a long jog would help me settle my thoughts. As I opened my closet, I focused on the simple routine of dressing and lacing up my shoes, using it as a distraction from the storm brewing inside me. I was in the middle of pulling on my sweatshirt when the door to my room swung open. He stepped inside, eyes focused on his phone, unaware that he'd walked right in on me. We froze, time seeming to stretch for a moment as we both took in the scene. "Oh, sorry," he stammered, his face turning red as he quickly looked away and stepped back toward the door. I didn't mean to." I couldn't help but laugh at his flustered expression, the way he seemed completely caught off guard by his own mistake. Usually people knock before entering a room," I said, trying to tease him, hoping it would ease the tension. "Didn't anyone teach you that rule?" His embarrassment only deepened, and for a brief second, I was the one caught off guard. I hadn't expected him to be so genuinely mortified over such a small thing. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, too embarrassed to meet my gaze. "Right? Of course. I just forgot. I should've." He stumbled over his words before finally finding a sheepish smile. "I'll leave you to it, then," he muttered, backing out of the room as quickly as he'd come in. He softly closed the door behind him. I stood there for a moment, watching the door as a strange mixture of emotions settled over me. His reaction had caught me off guard more than I wanted to admit. It was almost as if the air between us had shifted, in a way I couldn't quite describe, a subtle change that lingered throughout the rest of the morning. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing more than a simple mistake, just a momentary lapse in the usual boundaries. But as I pulled on my running shoes and headed out the door, the thought wouldn't leave me. The day passed quietly, the usual stillness of the apartment settling over me like an old, familiar weight. I hadn't seen him since that awkward moment earlier, and I started to wonder if he was avoiding me. Maybe he'd felt that same strange shift, that unspoken tension between us that had been building ever since the night before. I was halfway through tidying up the living room when I heard footsteps behind me. He hovered in the doorway for a moment, unsure if he should come any closer. I looked up and offered him a small, encouraging smile, hoping to ease the tension that had been lingering between us. "Hey," he said quietly, stepping into the room. "About this morning. I just wanted to say sorry again." I waved a hand dismissively, brushing off his apology. "Don't worry about it," I said lightly, trying to keep the mood casual. "It was nothing. Things like that happen. No harm done, right?" I added, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. He nodded, but his expression remained serious, as though he was still searching for the right words. "Yeah, I know. It's just, well, things feel a little different lately. I don't really know how to explain it." I understood exactly what he meant. Even if we couldn't put it into words, the air between us was undeniably charged, like there was some invisible current pulling us together despite everything. And though I knew I should keep my distance, maintain the boundaries that had kept us safe for so long, I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. As he spoke, I felt that familiar pull again, an invisible force that made me want to bridge the gap between us. Without thinking, I stepped closer, letting the space between us shrink. I didn't know what I was doing or why. It was like we were caught in a current neither of us could resist. Our eyes met, and in that moment, the silence between us felt louder than words. There were 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't let this happen. 1,000 reasons why we needed to stop. But in that instant, none of them mattered. Without saying a word, we leaned in, and our lips met in the briefest, softest touch. When it was over, I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest as reality settled in. He looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise and something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. We stood there, caught in the aftermath of that fleeting moment, neither of us knowing what to say next. Finally, he broke the silence. I should probably go," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of regret and relief as he turned and left the room. Once again, I was left alone. The quiet settled over me like a heavy blanket, and I was left trying to make sense of what had just happened. The days that followed were a tense, silent dance. Each morning, I half expected to run into him in the hallway or the kitchen, but he kept his distance. He lingered only in doorways, leaving rooms before I entered, avoiding any direct confrontation. I tried to convince myself this was for the best, that maybe he was just as confused as I was, that we both needed some space to figure out what these tangled feelings meant. And yet, with each passing day, the silence seemed to pull me deeper into its grip, as if some invisible force was drawing us back together. One evening, when my husband was out late for a work dinner, I found myself lying on the couch, mindlessly flicking through TV channels, barely noticing the flashing lights and sounds in front of me. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the windows, casting long shadows against the walls. I had almost dozed off when I heard footsteps approaching, tentative and slow, as though he wasn't sure if he should disturb me. He paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light from the hallway. "Is it okay if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost as if he feared breaking the fragile peace that hung between us. I nodded without a word, shifting over to make room on the couch. We sat there in silence, neither of us willing to speak, the unspoken tension between us filling the space like an invisible wall. The hum of the TV buzzed in the background, but neither of us paid it any attention. I could feel his presence beside me, the warmth of his body seeping into mine, and it was both comforting and unsettling, a strange mixture that made my chest tight. After a while, he broke the silence. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" he said, his voice barely audible. "Being here like this after everything." I nodded, my throat tight, struggling to find the right words. My mind was a whirlpool of emotions, and I didn't trust myself to speak without revealing more than I meant to. Instead, I simply looked at him, trying to communicate what I couldn't put into words. His eyes met mine, and in that brief moment, it felt as though all the walls between us crumbled. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing his. It was a small gesture, almost innocent, yet it felt like crossing a line we couldn't come back from. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand and let his fingers interlace with mine. The touch was simple, but it carried a weight of meaning that no words could express. We sat there, hands joined, for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching on as neither of us dared to break that fragile connection. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his face mere inches from mine. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause that seemed to stretch for a lifetime, and I could feel my heart racing. Caught between fear and something else, something I couldn't name. Our lips met in the softest, most tentative kiss, a fleeting moment that was over almost before it began. But even in that brief touch, I felt a rush of emotion, a longing that had been buried for far too long. When we pulled back, I looked away, the weight of guilt crashing over me. What were we doing? This wasn't a path we had any business walking down. And yet, I couldn't deny the pull between us, the feeling that something irrevocable had shifted. He seemed to sense my inner turmoil, his gaze steady, almost reassuring. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," he murmured, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "But I can't ignore what's happening. It's like there's something between us, and it's only getting stronger." I took a shaky breath, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I know," I said, my words barely a whisper. "But it's complicated. So many people could get hurt." He nodded, his expression somber but firm. "I understand," he said quietly. "But that doesn't change how I feel. And I don't think it changes how you feel either." I met his gaze, my heart pounding in my chest. He was right. There was no denying what had happened between us, no pretending it was just a passing feeling. It had taken root deep inside, and trying to ignore it wouldn't make it go away. But the weight of reality pressed down on me, reminding me of all the reasons this was wrong. In the end, he left the room quietly, as if sensing I needed space to process. I watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and longing, caught in the whirlwind of emotions I couldn't control. Once again, I was left alone with my thoughts, the soft hum of the television filling the empty space as the door clicked shut behind him. I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. A week later, my husband suggested we take a short trip to the cabin by the lake, a quiet retreat from the city that had always been our family's sanctuary. The thought of it warmed me, bringing memories of weekends spent fishing, cooking over an open fire, and listening to the rustling of the trees in the breeze. It was a place filled with memories I cherished, and yet now felt oddly uneasy about revisiting. My husband thought it would be a refreshing break, a chance for us to reconnect, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. We packed the car early the next morning, loading it with groceries, warm clothes, and everything we'd need for a quiet weekend in the woods. The drive was long and winding, the trees growing denser as we moved farther away from the city. He sat quietly in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery, while my husband chatted about upcoming projects and plans he'd been making. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the strange tension that seemed to settle over us, thick as the fog that hung in the air. When we arrived, the cabin looked just as I remembered it, a cozy wooden structure nestled at the edge of the lake, surrounded by towering pines. I took a deep breath of the crisp, clean air, hoping it would clear the fog in my mind. We spent the day unpacking, getting the fireplace going, and before long, the familiar smell of wood smoke filled the room. I told myself I could handle this, that whatever had happened between us in the city would fade in the peaceful solitude of the cabin. But as evening fell and the shadows stretched long across the room, the quiet of the cabin seemed to amplify everything I was trying to push down. We were all gathered in the small living room, the only light coming from the crackling fire. My husband was telling a story from his college days, his voice loud and cheerful, filling the room. But I was barely listening, my mind drifting. My gaze kept wandering toward him. He caught my eye once, just a fleeting glance, but it held more than I could put into words. I quickly looked away, guilt surging through me, yet unable to ignore the pull. After dinner, my husband suggested we take a walk by the lake, an old tradition of ours that I usually looked forward to. But tonight, I felt a reluctance I couldn't explain. The air was cool, still, the moonlight casting long shadows over the water. We walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel path. My husband took my hand, his grip warm and familiar, but I couldn't shake the sense of distance between us. It felt like I was walking beside a stranger. When we returned to the cabin, he excused himself, saying he had work calls to make, leaving the two of us alone. I watched him disappear into the other room, my heart pounding as I realized we were truly alone. For the first time since we'd arrived, the silence felt different, heavier, charged with a tension that had been building between us ever since we'd left the city. I found myself standing by the window, looking out over the fog-draped lake, feeling his presence beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Do you remember the last time we were here?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet, soft but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, my gaze still fixed on the dark water. "It was a long time ago," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, his shoulder brushing mine, a subtle, almost innocent touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine. "Things were simpler then," he said, his tone heavy with a truth neither of us was ready to confront. "Everything feels different now." I glanced up at him, meeting his eyes in the dim light. I could see the same confusion, the same pull that I felt. "Maybe it wasn't as different as it seemed," I said before I could stop myself. My words surprised me, but they hung in the air between us, undeniable. For a long moment, we stood there, neither of us daring to speak again, caught in the fragile space between what we wanted and what we knew was right. It would have been easy to close the gap, to let the unspoken tension between us take over, to give in to what was simmering just beneath the surface. But just as I felt myself leaning into that possibility, the creak of a door echoed from behind us. My husband's voice called out, light and casual, but with a curious undertone. "Hey, everything okay out here?" I stepped back instinctively, putting distance between us, my heart racing as though I'd been caught doing something forbidden. "Yes, of course," I replied, forcing a smile as I turned toward him. "Just enjoying the view." My husband gave me a quick, questioning look, glancing between the two of us, but didn't say anything more. He nodded and disappeared back into the other room. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, relief mingling with something else, something heavier, like disappointment. The moment had passed. The boundaries we'd been so close to crossing were still intact, but now they felt more fragile than ever. That night, I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, my thoughts a whirlpool of confusion. The quiet of the cabin seemed almost oppressive, a constant reminder of the line I couldn't cross, no matter how strong the pull between us. The next morning, the lake was shrouded in a dense fog, thick and impenetrable, casting an eerie, muted glow over everything. My husband decided to go out for an early hike, leaving me alone in the cabin. I welcomed the solitude, but a part of me couldn't shake the flutter of anxiety stirring inside. I found myself drifting toward the window, watching as the fog wrapped itself around the trees, the world outside now blurred, indistinct. I didn't hear him approach, but when I turned, he was standing in the doorway. His expression mirrored the unease that churned in my stomach. We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension between us almost palpable, as though the fog had somehow seeped into the room, clouding our judgment, blurring the line between right and wrong. He stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought he'd never leave," he said, his tone layered with something I couldn't quite name, relief, hesitation, and an undercurrent of something forbidden. His words hung in the air, their weight undeniable, and I felt my heart race in response. The pull between us, stronger than ever, made it difficult to breathe. I took a step back, instinctively trying to create space, to remind myself of everything I'd tried to hold on to. "We shouldn't," I stammered, my voice shaky, my resolve already starting to fracture. He took another step forward, his gaze fixed on mine, steady and unwavering. "Maybe not," he murmured, his voice low and steady, as though confessing something he had kept hidden for too long. "But that doesn't change the fact that we—" His words trailed off, but I understood him perfectly. The emotions that had been simmering between us, growing stronger each day, now felt undeniable. I could feel the walls of the cabin closing in around us, the fog pressing against the windows, a silent witness to the choices we were about to make. And then, just as his fingers grazed mine, a loud knock echoed through the cabin, shattering the fragile moment. We both froze, eyes widening in shock, as the sound reverberated through the room. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart pounding as reality came crashing back. My husband's voice called out from the other side of the door, cheerful and oblivious to the storm inside the room. "Are you two in there?" he asked. I thought I'd stop by the cabin before heading to the lake. I forced myself to take a deep breath, fighting the panic rising in my chest, struggling to regain control. "Yes," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're here." He paused outside the door, giving me a quick, questioning look. I gave a slight shake of my head, a silent warning not to say anything, not to break the fragile illusion of normalcy we were still trying to maintain. The door creaked open, and my husband stepped inside, smiling brightly as he glanced between us. For a moment, I feared he could see through me, that he could sense the turmoil that had nearly consumed us just moments before. But his expression remained unchanged, warm and completely unaware. He slipped his arm around my shoulders in the familiar, comforting gesture he had done 1,000 times before. "I'm glad we're all here together," he said, his voice filled with contentment, the kind of contentment that felt foreign, almost jarring in the wake of what had nearly happened. "This place holds so many memories, doesn't it?" he added, his eyes drifting toward the lake. I nodded, forcing a smile, trying to push down the guilt and confusion that lingered in my chest. I looked up at him, trying to hold on to the version of this reality where everything was as it should be. But even as his gaze returned to the lake, lost in a nostalgic reverie, I couldn't ignore the presence of the man beside me. His presence, even now, was a silent reminder of everything that had gone unsaid, of everything we had left unresolved. The rest of the day passed slowly, each moment dragging under the weight of what had almost happened. I found myself stealing glances at him, at the man whose presence seemed to haunt every corner of the room, each glance filled with questions that I knew would never have answers. We moved through the motions of the day, pretending everything was as it should be, but beneath the surface, the tension simmered. A constant reminder of the choices we had made and the ones we hadn't. As evening fell and the shadows lengthened once more, we gathered around the fire. My husband began telling his usual stories, his voice filling the quiet cabin with warmth and laughter. But even as I tried to focus on his familiar presence, I could feel his gaze on me, the man who had become both my temptation and my torment. Then, just as the fire began to die down, he turned to me, his expression unreadable, his voice barely a whisper. "What are we going to do?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge, a test of my resolve. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was I didn't know.